Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Donkey Kong. All great franchises with a strong brand, but are they all equally as great? It's hard to quantify what constitutes greatness, but if we had to give some kind of measurable value, we'd say a franchise is considered truly great when it can consistently create classic games that are considered iconic for the entire industry. This has to happen over the course of many years as we watch the franchise mature and age, never losing its luster. Mario, Zelda, and Metroid have all stood the test of time, creating masterpieces time and time again. Looking briefly back through their cherished history, we can easily spot their greatest titles. In the 1980s, we played Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda, and Metroid. Those games all launched their respective franchises and genres. In the 90s, Mario kept up his incredible track record with Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, and then Super Mario 64 when the Nintendo 64 launched. Likewise, the Zelda series blew people's minds with A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo, and then again with Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64. Lastly, Samus's outing in Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo may have arguably never been surpassed. While the games of the 2000s didn't quite feel as evolutionary as the jump from 2D to 3D in the 90s, Nintendo's Big Three still managed to produce games that stood out as the best of their class in their respective generation. Those include Super Mario Galaxy, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and the Metroid Prime series. More recently, we're still seeing a few big contenders such as Super Mario 3D World and hopefully soon Zelda Wii U. Nintendo's Big Three have managed to enter their fourth decade at the top of their game without any slowdown. But what about the Donkey Kong series? Where does that match up on this evolutionary scale? In the early 1980s, Donkey Kong created an entirely new genre, the 2D platformer. Whereas Super Mario Bros. On the NES would create the side-scrolling platformer, Donkey Kong first introduced platforming in a static, non-scrolling screen. This was the first time gamers were given that one new ability at their disposal that would eventually become a staple in the future of gaming: the ability to jump over harm's way. With Donkey Kong actually playing the role of the antagonist, you played as Jumpman, who later evolved into Mario, jumping over the barrels thrown by Donkey Kong, among other obstacles. We can cross the 1980s off on our list. Donkey Kong definitely got off to a good start with an acclaimed classic. Let's move on to the 1990s. In 1994, Rare was at the height of its game development mastery and design creativity. Rare ended up raising the bar on 2D platforming, causing Shigeru Miyamoto to feel like he needed to match their leaps in technology. The blend of pre-rendered 3D graphics in an age of flat pixelated sprites, fluid and precise 2D gameplay, irresistible personality and British humor, and an ever-catchy soundtrack combined to lay the path of a new type of Donkey Kong series, the Donkey Kong Country franchise. The next 2 decades wouldn't change from the Donkey Kong format that Rare had proposed, so we would definitely consider the first game in this new series to be a classic of the 90s. Its 2 SNES sequels matched its level of quality while keeping the franchise fresh with new ideas. In 1999, the Mario and Zelda series had already demonstrated how to take a 2D series and evolve it into a 3-dimensional world. Donkey Kong had to find a way to follow in Mario's 3D platforming footsteps, but make it even better. However, instead of evolving the platforming genre, Rare's approach was simply to take the Super Mario 64 formula and give it steroids in Donkey Kong 64. The game was enormous, with a huge amount of collectibles and things to unlock. There was also more characters and more abilities, but did this really mean the game was better than Mario 64? Some would argue that the Banjo-Kazooie series from Rare that preceded Donkey Kong 64 became more of a classic. Others would say the massive collectathon was just a bit too overwhelming. Most don't disagree that Donkey Kong 64 was ultimately a very fun, enjoyable game, with a massive scope and many hours of gameplay, but this wasn't the revolution we had hoped for. After Rare had gone the way of the dodo, more precisely, got bought out by Microsoft, the Donkey Kong franchise went on hiatus throughout the GameCube era. There were a few spin-offs, namely Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, Donkey Konga, and DK King of Swing. However, the core franchise wouldn't see a new game until 2010, when Nintendo handed off their precious franchise to the West, where first-party studio, Retro Studios, got the chance to take a spin with nostalgia. After all those years, Nintendo still hadn't found a way to evolve the original Donkey Kong Country formula, so instead of trying something new, They went back to what made the Donkey Kong Country series fun and gave it a fresh coat of paint in Donkey Kong Country Returns for the Wii. While the 2D platforming was back as the core gameplay, new 3D models were used for the characters and background, giving more detail and personality to the environments. The difficulty level was up to notch to make the gameplay even more challenging, and the familiar upbeat music was back. A blend of nostalgia and gameplay perfection, Donkey Kong Country Returns performed well with critics and fans. Still, no one would consider this new game to be an evolution of any kind. There was no innovation to be found, it was more like a big thank you to the fans of the original Donkey Kong Country games on SNES. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze came out in 2014, and it somehow seemed to top the first game by retro. The variety in the level design was unparalleled. Original music composer David Wise was back on the team for the first time since Donkey Kong 64, and gameplay seemed to be even more polished. Still, precision and polish can only take a game so far. Gamers seem far more excited about where Zelda Wii U would take the Zelda series next, or what would be the next evolutionary step of the Metroid series. The Donkey Kong franchise seemed to have gone off the evolutionary train and had no drive to move on to the next station. So if we ask ourselves again, was the Donkey Kong franchise as great as Mario, Metroid, and Zelda? The answer is it's a mixed bag. There were times where it hit greatness and times where it was merely good. The original Donkey Kong in arcade launched the platforming genre, and the Donkey Kong Country series raised the bar on the collective genre while introducing a new beloved series for the franchise. However, Donkey Kong 64 and the more recent Donkey Kong Country games seemed complacent with already proven forms of platforming gameplay and didn't take the franchise to a new place. What do you think? Is the Donkey Kong franchise as good as the best Nintendo has to offer? Does it deserve a place right next to Mario, Metroid, and Zelda? Or does it belong one rung down on the Nintendo franchise ladder? Be sure to let us know in the comments below, and I'll see you on the next episode of Nintendo Files.